Hello everyone and welcome to the Unanswered Questions True Crime Podcast.
I have spent hours and hours investigating this.
He basically told her that people have been killed. Journalists, independent investigators, people like that disappeared. It frightened her to the bone.
There's more to the story than meets the eye.
There were rumors of torture and homicide and sexual abuse, all sorts of egregious, horrendous crimes.
He was polygraphed 3 times. Each of those 3 showed evasions.
His resumes were a skeleton of truth.
He was mad at the world, and particularly mad at the government.
The study that he commissioned had described a fictional terrorist attack.
If people have died over this, it means you're getting close to the truth.
You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to say, what the fuck?
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Money Podcast, Unanswered Questions, where every week we'll endeavour to discuss a mysterious unsolved case. There's many lingering unanswered questions. So I hope you enjoy, and as always, leave me some feedback on what you think about the show and rate it as well. Now on to the show. This week we'll be talking about the Profumo affair. Now, the Profumo affair was a major political scandal in 20th century British politics. John Profumo, the Secretary of State for War in Harold Macmillan's Conservative government, had an extramarital affair with a 19-year-old model, Christine Keeler, beginning in 1961. Profumo denied the affair in a statement to the House of Commons, but weeks later, a police investigation exposed the truth, proving that he had lied in his statement. The scandal severely damaged the credibility of Macmillan's government, and Macmillan resigned as Prime Minister in October of 1963, citing ill health. Ultimately, the fallout contributed to the Conservative government's defeat by the Labour Party in the 1964 general election. When the Profumo affair was first revealed, public interest was heightened by reports that Keeler may have been simultaneously involved with Captain, I'm going to butcher this name, Yevgeny Ivanov, a Soviet naval attaché, thereby creating a possible national security risk. Keeler knew both Profumo and Ivanov through her friendship with Stephen Ward, an osteopath and socialite who had taken her under his wing. The exposure of the affair generated rumours of other sex scandals and drew official attention to the activities of Ward, who was charged with a series of immorality offences. Perceiving himself as a scapegoat for the misdeeds of others, Ward took a fatal overdose during the final stages of his trial, which found him guilty of living off the immoral earnings of Keeler and her friend Mandy Rice-Davies. An inquiry into the Profumo affair by a senior judge, Lord Denning, assisted by a senior civil servant, T.A. Critchley, concluded that there had been no breaches of security arising from the Ivanov connection, although Denning's report was later described as superficial and unsatisfactory. Profumo subsequently worked as a volunteer at Toynbee Hall and East London Charitable Trust. By 1975, he had been officially rehabilitated, although he did not return to public life. He died, honoured and respected, in 2006. By contrast, Keeler found it difficult to escape the negative image attached to her by press, law and parliament throughout the scandal. In various, sometimes contradictory accounts, she challenged Denning's conclusions relating to security issues. Ward's conviction has been described by an analyst as an act of establishment revenge rather than serving justice. In the 2010s, the Criminal Cases Review Commission reviewed his case, but ultimately decided against referring it to the Court of Appeal. Dramatizations of the Profumo affair have been shown on stage and screen. Now we get into the background of this case, first starting with the government and press. In the early 1960s, the British news media were dominated by several high-profile spying stories: the breaking of the Portland spy ring in 1961, the capture and sentencing of George Blake in the same year, and in 1962, the case of John Vassal, a homosexual Admiralty clerk who had been blackmailed into spying by the Soviet Union. Vassal was subsequently sentenced to 18 years in prison. After suggestions in the press that Vassal had been shielded by his political masters, the responsible minister Thomas Galbraith resigned from the government pending inquiries. Galbraith was later exonerated by the Vassal Tribunal, after which Judge Lord Radcliffe sent 2 newspaper journalists to prison for refusing to reveal their sources for sensational and uncorroborated stories about Vassal's private life. The imprisonment severely damaged relations between the press and the Conservative government of Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. Columnist Paul Johnson in the New Statesman warned, any Tory minister or MP who gets involved in a scandal during the next year or so must expect, I regret to say, the full treatment. End quote. Now we get into who John Profumo was. John Dennis Profumo, CBE, born 30th of January 1915 and died on 9th of March 2006, was a British politician whose career ended in 1963 after a sexual relationship with the 19-year-old model Christine Keeler in 1961. The scandal, which became known as the Profumo affair, led to his resignation from the Conservative government of Harold Macmillan. After his resignation, Profumo worked as a volunteer at Turnby Hall, a charity in East London, and became its chief fundraiser. These charitable activities helped to restore his reputation, and he was appointed a commander of the British Empire, CBE, in 1975. Now we come to his early life and career. Profumo was born in Kensington, London, the son of Albert Profumo, a diplomat and barrister of Italian ancestry who died in 1940. He attended Harrow School and Brasenose College in Oxford. In 1933, Jack Profumo began a long-term relationship with the German student Gisela Klenn, who later became a model and subsequently worked for German intelligence in Paris, and eventually married an American called Edward Weingard. Secret Service papers state Profumo also wrote to Weingard while he was an MP, Member of Parliament. On the 1st of July 1939, he was commissioned into the Royal Armoured Corps as a second lieutenant. He had previously been a member of the Officer Training Corps and a cadet sergeant while at Harrow. He served in North Africa with their North Hampshire Yeomanry as a captain, acting major, where he was mentioned in dispatches. He landed in Normandy on D-Day and was engaged in the subsequent fierce fighting to secure that region of France. His final rank in the British Army was brigadier. On the 21st of December 1944, Major, temporary Lieutenant Colonel Profumo was appointed an Officer of the Order of the British Empire, OBE, Military Division, in recognition of gallant and distinguished service in Italy, specifically for his service on Field Marshal Sir Harold Alexander's staff commanding the 15th Army Group. In November 1947, Acting Colonel Profumo was awarded the Bronze Star Medal by the United States in recognition of distinguished services in the cause of the Allies. Now we get to his political career. In 1940, while still serving in the army, Profumo was elected to the House of Commons as a Conservative Member of Parliament for Kettering in Northamptonshire at a by-election on the 3rd of March. Shortly afterwards, he voted against the Chamberlain government in the debate following the British defeat at Narvik in Norway. This defiance on Profumo's part enraged the Chief Whip David Margeson, who said to him, quote, "I can tell you this, you utterly contemptible little shit. On every morning that you wake up for the rest of your life, you'll be ashamed of what you did last night." End quote. Profumo later remarked that Margeson, quote, "couldn't have been more wrong." End quote. Profumo was then the youngest MP, and by the time of his death, he'd become the last surviving former head of the 1940 House of Commons. At the 1945 election, Profumo was defeated at Kettering by the Labour candidate Dick Mitchinson. Later in 1945, he was Chief of Staff to the British mission to Japan. In 1950, he left the army, and at the general election in February of 1950, he was elected for Stratford-upon-Avon in Warwickshire, a safe Conservative seat. Profumo was a well-connected politician with a good war record, and despite Margeson's aforementioned outburst, was highly regarded in the Conservative Party. These qualities helped him to rise steadily through the ranks of the Conservative government elected in 1951. He was appointed Parliamentary Secretary to the Ministry of Civil Aviation in November of 1952, Joint Parliamentary Secretary to the Ministry of Transport and Civil Aviation in November of 1953, Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for the Colonies in January of 1957, Parliamentary Under Secretary of State at the Foreign Office in November of 1958, and Minister of State for Foreign Affairs in January of 1959. In July of 1960, he was appointed Secretary of State for War outside of the Cabinet and was sworn of the Privy Council. In 1954, he married the actress Valerie Hobson. Now we get into his later life. Shortly after his resignation, Profumo was invited to work at Turnby Hall as a volunteer by Walter Birmingham, who was a warden there. Turnby Hall is a charity based in the East End of London, and Profumo continued his work there for the rest of his life, becoming Turnby Hall's chief fundraiser and using his political skills and contacts to raise large sums of money. All this work was done as a volunteer, since Profumo was able to live on his inherited wealth. His wife, the actress Valerie Hobson, also devoted herself to charity until her death in 1998. In the eyes of some, Profumo's charity work redeemed his reputation. His friend's social reform campaigner, Lord Longford, said he felt more admiration for Profumo than for all the men I've known in my lifetime. End quote. Profumo was appointed a Commander of the Order of the British Empire, CBE Civil Division, in the 1975 birthday honours, and received the honour at a Buckingham Palace ceremony from Queen Elizabeth II, signalling his return to respectability. In 1995, former Conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, known as the Iron Lady, invited him to a 70th birthday dinner where he sat next to the Queen. He appeared only occasionally in public, particularly in his last years when he used a wheelchair. His last appearance was at the memorial service for Sir Edward Heath on the 8th of November 2005. Now we get into death and tributes to him. On the 7th of March 2006, Profumo suffered a stroke and was admitted to London's Chelsea and Westminster Hospital. He died 2 days later, surrounded by his family at the age of 91. After his death, many commentators said that he should be remembered as much for his contribution to society after his fall from political grace as for the scandal of 1963, which caused that fall. He was cremated at Mortlake Crematorium. His ashes were buried next to those of his wife at the family vault in front of St. Peter's Church in Hersham. Now we get into Christine Keeler, Mandy Rice-Davies, and Lord Astor. Christine Keeler born in Uxbridge in 1942, left school at age 15 with no qualifications and took a series of short-lived jobs in shops, offices and cafes. She aspired to be a model and at age 16 had a photograph published in Titbits magazine. In August of 1959, Keeler found work as a topless showgirl at Maury's Cabaret Club in Beat Street, Soho. This long-established club attracted a distinguished clientele who Keeler wrote, quote, "could look but could not touch," end quote. Shortly after starting at Murray's, Keeler was introduced to a client, the society osteopath Stephen Ward. Captivated by Ward's charm, she agreed to move into his flat in a relationship she described as like brother and sister, affectionate but not sexual. Keeler left Ward after a few months to become the mistress of the property dealer Peter Rackham, and later shared lodgings with Mandy Rice-Davies, a fellow Murray's dancer 2.5 years her junior. The two girls left Murray's and attempted without success to pursue careers as freelance models. Keeler also lived for short periods with various boyfriends, but regularly returned to Ward, who had acquired a house in Wimpole Mews, Marylebone. There, she met many of Ward's friends, among them Lord Astor, a longtime patient who was also a political ally of Profumo. She often spent weekends at a riverside cottage that Ward rented on Astor's country estate, Cliveden in Buckinghamshire. Now we get into Stephen Ward and Yevgeny Ivanov. Stephen Ward, born in Hertfordshire in 1912, qualified as an osteopath in the United States. After the Second World War, he began practicing in Cavendish Square, London, where he rapidly established a good reputation and attracted many distinguished patients. These connections, together with his personal charm, brought him considerable social success. In his spare time, Ward attended art classes at the Slade School and developed a profitable sideline and portrait sketches. In 1960, he was commissioned by the Illustrated London News to provide a series of portraits of national and international figures. These included members of the royal family, among them Prince Philip and Princess Margaret. Ward hoped to visit the Soviet Union to draw portraits of Russian leaders. To help him, one of his patients, the Daily Telegraph editor Sir Colin Coote, arranged an introduction to Captain Yevgeny Ivanov, anglicised as Eugene, listed as a naval attaché at the Soviet embassy. British intelligence, MI5, knew from the double agent Oleg Penkovsky, who I've covered in a previous podcast episode, that Ivanov was an intelligence officer in the Soviet GRU. Ward and Ivanov became firm friends. Ivanov frequently visited Ward at Wimpole Mews, where he met Keeler and Rice-Davies, and sometimes joined Ward's weekend parties at Cliveden. MI5 considered Ivanov a potential defector and sought Ward's help to this end, providing him with a case officer known as Woods. Ward was later used by the Foreign Office as a back channel through Ivanov to the Soviet Union and was involved in unofficial diplomacy during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. Ward's closeness to Ivanov raised concerns about his loyalty, and according to Lord Denning's September 1963 report, Ivanov often asked Ward questions about British foreign policy, and Ward did his best to provide answers. Now we get into the origins behind this. Cliveden, July of 1961. During the weekend of 8th of 9th of July 1961, Keeler was among several guests of Ward at the Spring Cottage at Cliveden. That same weekend, at the main house, Profumo and his wife Valerie were among the large gathering from the worlds of politics and the arts which Astor was hosting in honour of Pakistani President Ayub Khan. Sorry if I get that name wrong. On the Saturday evening, Ward and Astor's parties mingled at the Cliveden swimming pool, which Ward and his guests had permission to use. Keeler, who had been swimming naked, was introduced to Profumo while trying to cover herself with a skimpy towel. She was, Profumo informed his son many years later, a very pretty girl and very sweet, end quote. Keeler did not initially know who Profumo was, but was impressed that he was the husband of a famous film star and was prepared to have a bit of fun with him. The next afternoon, the two parties reconvened at the pool and were joined by Ivanov, who had arrived that morning. There followed what Lord Denning described as a light-hearted and frolicsome bathing party where everyone was in bathing costumes and nothing indecent took place at all, end quote. Profumo was greatly attracted to Keller and promised to be in touch with her. Ward asked Ivanov to accompany Keller back to London, where according to Keller they had sex. Some commentators doubt this. Keller was generally outspoken about her sexual relationships, yet said nothing openly about sex with Ivanov until she informed a newspaper 18 months later. On the 12th of July 1961, Ward reported on the weekend's events to MI5. He told Woods that Ivanov and Profumo had met and that the latter had shown considerable interest in Keller. Ward also stated that he had been asked by Ivanov for information about the future arming of West Germany with nuclear weapons. This request for military information did not greatly disturb MI5, who expected a GRU officer to ask such questions. Profumo's interest in Keller was an unwelcome complication in MI5's plans to use her in a honey trap operation against Ivanov to help secure his defection. Woods therefore referred the issue to MI5's Director General, Sir Roger Hollis. Now we get into the affair. A few days after the Cliveden weekend, Profumo contacted Keller. The affair that ensued was brief. Some commentators have suggested that it ended after a few weeks, while others believe that it continued with decreasing fervour until December 1961. The relationship was characterised by Keller as an unromantic relationship without expectations, a screw of convenience, although she also states that Profumo hoped for a longer-term commitment and that he offered to set her up in a flat. More than 20 years later, Profumo described Keller in conversation with his son as someone who, quote, seemed to like sexual intercourse but who was completely uneducated, end quote, with no conversation beyond makeup, hair and gramophone records. Now we get into Profumo's darling letter to Keller on August 9th of 1961. Quote, Darling, Alice, something's blown up tomorrow night and I can't therefore make it. I leave the next day for various trips and then a holiday, so won't be able to see you again until sometime in September. Blast it! Please take care of yourself and don't run away. Love, Jay. End quote. The couple usually met at Wimpole Mews when Ward was absent, although once when Hobson was away, Profumo took Keller to his home at Chester Terrace in Regent's Park. On one occasion, he borrowed a Bentley from his ministerial colleague John Hare and took Keller for a drive around London, and another time the couple had a drink with Viscount Ward, the former Secretary of State for Air. During their time together, Profumo gave Keller a few small presents and once the sum of £20 as a gift for her mother. Keller maintains that although Ward asked her to obtain information from Profumo about the deployment of nuclear weapons, she did not do so. Profumo was equally adamant that no such discussions took place. On the 9th of August, Profumo was interviewed informally by Sir Norman Brooke, the Cabinet Secretary, who had also been advised by Hollis of Profumo's involvement with Ward's group. Brooke warned the Minister of the dangers of being entangled with Ward, since MI5 were at the stage unsure of his dependability. It is possible that Brooke asked Profumo to help MI5 in its efforts to secure Ivanov's defection, a request which Profumo declined. Although Brooke did not indicate knowledge of the relationship with Keller, Profumo may have suspected that he knew. That same day, Profumo wrote Keller a letter beginning Darling, cancelling an assignation they had made for the following day. Some commentators have assumed that this letter ended the association. Keller insisted that the affair ended later after her persistent refusals to stop living with Ward. Now we get into the developing scandal around this case. First we have Gordon and Edgecombe. In October of 1961, Keller accompanied Ward to Notting Hill, then a rundown district of London replete with West Indian music clubs and cannabis dealers. At the Rio Cafe, they encountered Aloysius Lucky Gordon, a Jamaican jazz singer with a history of violence and petty crime. Gordon and Keller embarked on an affair which in her own accounts was marked by equal measure of violence and tenderness on his part. Gordon became very possessive, jealous of Keller's other social contacts. He began confronting her friends and often telephoned her at unsocial hours. In November, Keller left Wimpole Mews and moved to a flat in Dolphin Square overlooking the Thames at Pimlico, where she entertained friends. When Gordon continued to harass Keller, he was arrested by the police and charged with assault. Keller later agreed to drop the charges. In July of 1962, the first inklings of a possible Profumo-Keeler-Ivanov triangle had been hinted in coded terms in the gossip column of the society magazine Queen. Under the heading "Sentences I'd Like to Hear the End Of," appeared the wording, "Called an MI5 because every time the chauffeur-driven Zills drew up at her front door, out of her back door into a chauffeur-driven Hummer slipped." Keeler was then in New York City with Rice-Davies in an abortive attempt to launch their modelling careers there. On her return to encounter Gordon's threats, Keeler formed a relationship with Johnny Edgecombe, an ex-merchant seaman from Antigua, with whom she lived for a while in Brentford, just west of London. Edgecombe became similarly possessed himself after he and Gordon clashed violently on the 27th of October 1962, when Edgecombe slashed his rival with a knife. Keeler broke up with Edgecombe shortly afterwards because of his domineering behaviour. On the 14th of December 1962, Keeler and Rice-Davies were together at 17 Wimpole Mews when Edgecombe arrived, demanding to see Keeler. When he was not allowed in, he fired several shots at the front door, and shortly afterwards Edgecombe was arrested and charged with attempted murder and other offences. In brief press accounts, Keeler was described as a freelance model and Miss Marilyn Davies an actress. In the wake of the incident, Keeler began to talk indiscreetly about Ward, Profumo, Ivanov and the Edgecombe shooting. Among those to whom she told her story was John Lewis, a former Labour MP whom she had met by chance in a nightclub. Lewis, a long-standing enemy of Ward, passed this information to Whig, his one-time parliamentary colleague, who began his own investigation. Now we get into the mounting pressures on this case. On the 22nd of January 1963, the Soviet government, sensing a possible scandal, recalled Ivanov. Aware of increasing public interest, Keeler attempted to sell his story to the national newspapers. The Radcliffe Tribunal's ongoing inquiry into press behaviour during the Vassal case was making newspapers nervous, and only two showed interest in Keeler's story, the Sunday Pictorial and the News of the World. As the latter would not join an auction, Keeler accepted the Pictorial's offer of a £200 down payment and a further £800 when the story was published. The Pictorial retained a copy of the Darling letter. Meanwhile, the News of the World alerted Ward and Astor, whose names had been mentioned by Keeler, and they in turn informed Profumo. When Profumo's lawyers tried to persuade Keeler not to publish, the compensation that she demanded was so large that they considered charges of extortion. Ward informed the Pictorial that Keeler's story was largely false and threatened to sue if it was printed, whereupon the newspaper withdrew its offer, although Keeler kept the £200. Keeler then gave details of the affair with Profumo to a police officer who did not pass on this information to MI5 or the legal authorities. By this time, many of Profumo's political colleagues had heard rumours of this entanglement and of the existence of a potentially incriminating letter. Nevertheless, his denials were accepted by the government's principal law officers and the Conservative Chief Whip, although with some private scepticism. Macmillan, mindful of the injustice done to Galbraith on the basis of rumours, was determined to support his minister and took no action. Edgecombe's trial began on the 14th of March, but Keeler, one of the Crown's key witnesses, was missing. She had, without informing the court, gone to Spain, although at this stage her whereabouts were unknown. Her unexplained absence caused a press sensation. Every newspaper knew the rumours linking Keeler with Profumo, but refrained from reporting any direct connection. In the wake of the Radcliffe inquiry, they were, in Whig's later words, willing to wound but afraid to strike. They could only hint by front-page juxtapositions of stories and photographs that Profumo might be connected to Keeler's disappearance. Despite Keeler's absence, the judge proceeded with the case. Edgecombe was found guilty on a lesser charge of possessing a firearm with intent to endanger life and sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. A few days after the trial, on March 21st, the satirical magazine Private Eye printed the most detailed summary so far of the rumours, with the main characters lightly disguised. Mr. James Montsey, Miss Gay Funloving, Dr. Spock, and Vladimir Bolokov. End quote. Now we come to the personal statement that was made. The newly elected leader of the opposition, Labour Party Harold Wilson, was initially advised by his colleagues to have nothing to do with Whig's private dossier on the Profumo rumours. On the 21st of March, with the press fervour over the missing witness at its height, the party changed its stance. During a House of Commons debate, Whig used parliamentary privilege to ask the Home Secretary to categorically deny the truth of rumours connecting a minister to Keeler, Rice-Davies and the Edgecombe shooting. He did not name Profumo, who was not in the House. Later in the debate, Barbara Castle, the Labour MP for Blackburn, referred to the missing witness and hinted at a possible perversion of justice. The Home Secretary, Henry Brooke, refused to comment, adding that Whig and Castle should seek other means of making these insinuations if they are prepared to substantiate them. End quote. At the conclusion of the debate, the government's law officers and chief whip agreed that Profumo should assert his innocence in a personal statement to the House. Such statements are, by long-standing tradition, made on the particular honour of the member and are accepted by the House without question. In the early hours on the 22nd of March, Profumo and his lawyers met with ministers and together agreed on appropriate wording. Later that morning, Profumo made his statement to a crowded House. He acknowledged friendships with Keller and Ward, the former of whom he said he had last seen in December of 1961. He had met a Mr. Ivanov twice, also in 1961. He stated, quote, "There was no impropriety whatsoever in my acquaintanceship with Miss Keller," and added, "I shall not hesitate to issue rights for libel and slander if scandalous allegations are made or repeated outside the House." End quote. That afternoon, Profumo was photographed at Sandown Park Racecourse in the company of the Queen Mother. Now we come to another quote that was made by Christine Keeler in a press interview on the 25th of March 1963. Quote, "The trouble is, I'm 21. I have lived in the West End of London and frequently been to parties with well-known people present. Presumably, if I'd been 52 and a housewife from Surboyton, there would have been none of this trouble." End quote. While the matter was officially considered closed, many individual MPs had doubts, although none openly expressed disbelief at this stage. Wigg later said that he left the House that morning with black rage in my heart because I knew what the facts were. I knew the truth. End quote. Most newspapers were editorially non-committal. Only The Guardian, under the headline "Mr. Profumo Cleans the Air," stated openly that the statement should be taken at its face value. Within a few days, press attention was distracted by the re-emergence of Keller in Madrid. She expressed astonishment at the fuss her absence had caused, adding that her friendship with Profumo and his wife was entirely innocent and that she had many friends in important positions. Keller claimed that she had not deliberately missed the Edgecombe trial but had been confused about the date. She was required to forfeit her recognizance of £40, but no other action was taken against her. Now we come to the exposure in this case. First we have the investigation and resignations. Shortly after Profumo's Commons statement, Ward appeared on independent television news where he endorsed Profumo's version and dismissed all rumours and insinuations as baseless. Ward's own activities had become a matter of official concern, and on the 1st of April 1963, the Metropolitan Police began to investigate his affairs. They interviewed 140 of Ward's friends, associates and patients, maintained a 24-hour watch on his home and tapped his telephone, this last action requiring direct authorization from Brooke. Among those who gave statements was Keller, who contradicted her earlier assurances and confirmed her sexual relationship with Profumo, providing corroborative details of the interior of the Chester Terrace house. The police put pressure on reluctant witnesses. Rice-Davies was remanded to Holloway Prison for a driving licence offence and held there for 8 days until she agreed to testify against Ward. Meanwhile, Profumo was awarded costs and £50 in damages against the British distributors of an Italian magazine that had printed a story hinting at his guilt. He donated the proceeds to an army charity. This did not deter Private Eye from including Sextus Profano in their parody of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. On the 18th of April 1963, Keller was attacked at the home of a friend. She accused Gordon, who was arrested and held. According to Knightley and Kennedy's account, the police offered to drop the charges if Gordon would testify against Ward, but he refused. The effects of the police inquiry were proving ruinous to Ward, whose practice was collapsing rapidly. On the 7th of May, he met Macmillan's private secretary, Timothy Bligh, to ask that the police inquiry into his affairs be halted. He added that he had been covering for Profumo, whose common statement was substantially false. Bligh took notes but failed to take action. On the 19th of May, Ward wrote to Brooke with essentially the same request as that to Bligh, only to be told that the Home Secretary had no power to interfere with the police inquiry. Ward then gave details to the press, but no paper would print the story. He also wrote to Wilson, who showed the letter to Macmillan. Although privately disdainful of Wilson's motives, after discussions with Hollis, the Prime Minister was sufficiently concerned about Ward's general activities to ask the Lord Chancellor, Lord Dilhorne, to inquire into possible security breaches. On the 31st of May 1963, at the start of the parliamentary White Sun recess, Profumo and his wife flew to Venice for a short holiday. At their hotel, they received a message asking Profumo to return as soon as possible. Believing that his bluff had been called, Profumo then told his wife the truth, and they decided to return immediately. They found that Macmillan was on holiday in Scotland. On Tuesday, June 4th, Profumo confessed the truth to Bligh, confirming that he had lied, resigned from the government, and applied for the office of Steward of the Shillett and Hundreds in order to give up his House of Commons seat. date. Bly informed Macmillan of these events by telephone. The resignation was announced on the 5th of June when the formal exchange of letters between Profumo and Macmillan were published. The Times called Profumo's lies a great tragedy for the probity of public life in Britain, while the Daily Mirror hinted that not all the truth had been told and referred to skeletons in many cupboards. Now we come to the retribution in this case. Gordon's trial for the attack on Keller began on the day Profumo's resignation was made public. He maintained that his innocence would be established by two witnesses who, the police told the court, could not be found. On the 7th of June, principally on the evidence of Keller, Gordon was found guilty and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. The following day, Ward was arrested and charged with immorality offences. On the 9th of June, freed from Profumo's libel threats, the News of the World published The Confessions of Christine, an account which helped to fashion the public image of Ward as a sexual predator and probable tool of the Soviets. The Sunday Mirror, formerly the Sunday Pictorial, printed Profumo's darling letter. Quote, I myself feel that the time will come very soon when my right Hon friend, the Prime Minister, ought to make way for a much younger colleague. I feel that ought to happen. Perhaps some of the words of Browning's might be appropriate in his poem on the Lost Leader, in which he wrote, let him never come back to us. There would be doubt, hesitation, and pain, forced praise on our part, the glimmer of twilight, never glad, confident morning again. And that was a quote by Nigel Birch, House of Commons, on the 17th of June, 1963. In advance of the House of Commons debate on Profumo's resignation, due 17th of June, David Watt in The Spectator defined Macmillan's position as an intolerable dilemma for which he can only escape by being proved either ludicrously naive, or unconfident, or deceitful, or all three. End quote. Meanwhile, the press speculated about possible cabinet resignations, and several ministers felt it necessary to demonstrate their loyalty to the Prime Minister. In a BBC interview on the 13th of June, Lord Hailsham, holder of several ministerial offices, denounced Profumo in a manner which, according to the Observer, had to be seen to be believed. Hailsham said that a great party is not to be brought down because of a squalid affair between a woman of easy virtue and a proven liar. End quote. In the debate, Wilson concentrated almost exclusively on the extent to which Macmillan and his colleagues had been dilatory in not identifying a clear security risk arising from Profumo's association with Ward and his circle. Macmillan responded that he should not be held culpable for believing a colleague who had repeatedly asserted his innocence. He mentioned the false allegations against Galbraith and the failure of the security services to share their detailed information with him. In the general debate, the sexual aspects of the scandal were fully discussed. Nigel Birch, the Conservative MP for West Flintshire, referred to Keller as a professional prostitute and asked rhetorically, what a whore's about? Keller was otherwise branded a tart and a poor little slut. Ward was vilified throughout as a likely Soviet agent. One conservative referred to the treason of Dr. Ward. Most conservatives, whatever their reservations, were supportive of Macmillan, with only Birch suggesting that he should consider retirement. In the subsequent vote on the government's handling of the affair, 27 conservatives abstained, reducing the government's majority to 69. Most newspapers considered the extent of the defection significant, and several forecast that Macmillan would soon resign. After the parliamentary debate, newspapers published further sensational stories hinting at widespread immorality within Britain's governing class. A story emanating from Rice-Davies concerned a naked masked man who acted as a waiter at sex parties. Rumours suggested that he was a cabinet minister or possibly a member of the royal family. Malcolm Mudridge in the Sunday Mirror wrote of the slow, sure death of the upper classes. On the 21st of June, Macmillan instructed Lord Denning, the Master of the Rolls, to investigate and report on the growing range of rumours. Ward's committal proceedings began a week later at Marylebone Magistrates Court, where the Crown's evidence was fully reported in the press. Ward was committed for trial on charges of living off the earnings of prostitution and procuration of girls under 21, and released on bail. With the Ward case now sub judice, the press pursued related stories. The People reported that Scotland Yard had begun an inquiry in parallel with Denning's into homosexual practices as well as sexual laxity among civil servants, military officers and MPs. On the 24th of June, the Daily Mirror, under a banner heading Prince Philip and the Profumo Scandal, dismissed what it termed the foul rumour that the Prince had been involved in the affair without disclosing the nature of the rumour. Ward's trial began at the Old Bailey on July 28th. He was charged with living off the earnings of Keller, Rice-Davies, and 2 other prostitutes, and with procuring women under 21 to have sex with other persons. The thrust of the prosecution's case related to Keller and Rice-Davies, and turned on whether the small contributions to household expenses or loan repayments they had given to Ward while living with him amounted to his living off their prostitution. Ward's approximate income at the time, from his practice and from his portraiture, had been around £5,500 a year, a substantial sum at that time. In his speeches and examination of witnesses, the prosecuting counsel Mervyn Griffith-Jones portrayed Ward as representing the very depths of lechery and depravity. The judge, Sir Archie Marshall, was equally hostile, drawing particular attention to the fact that none of Ward's supposed society friends had been prepared to speak up for him. Towards the end of the trial, news came that Gordon's conviction for assault had been overturned. Marshall did not disclose to the jury that Gordon's witnesses had turned up and testified that Keller, a key prosecution witness against Ward, had given false evidence at Gordon's trial. After listening to Marshall's damning summing up, on the evening of the 30th of July, Ward took an overdose of sleeping tablets and was taken to hospital. On the next day, he was found guilty in absentia on the charges relating to Keller and Rice-Davies, and acquitted on the other counts. Sentence was postponed until Ward was fit to appear, but on the 3rd of August, he died without regaining consciousness. On the 9th of August, a coroner's jury ruled Ward's death as a suicide by barbiturate poisoning, though some biographers consider the possibility that he was murdered. Now we get into the aftermath of this case. Lord Denning's report was awaited with great anticipation by the public. Published on the 26th of September 1963, it concluded that there had been no security leaks in the Profumo affair and that the security services and government ministers had acted appropriately. Profumo had been guilty of an indiscretion, but no one could doubt his loyalty. Denning also found no evidence to link members of the government with associated scandals such as the Man in the Mask. He laid most of the blame for the affair on Ward, an utterly immoral man whose diplomatic activities were misconceived and misdirected. Although the Spectator considered that the report marked the end of the affair, many commentators were disappointed with its content. Young found many questions unanswered and some of the reasoning defective, while Davenport Hines, writing long after the event, condemns the report as disgraceful, slipshod and prurient. After the Denning report, in defiance of general expectations that he would resign shortly, Macmillan announced his intention to stay on. On the eve of the Conservative Party's annual conference in October of 1963, he fell ill. His condition was less serious than he imagined, and his life was not in danger, but convinced he had cancer, he resigned abruptly. Macmillan's successor as Prime Minister was Lord Home, who renounced his peerage and served as Sir Alec Douglas Home. In the October 1964 general election, the Conservative Party was narrowly defeated and Wilson became Prime Minister. A later commentator opined that the Profumo affair had destroyed the old aristocratic Conservative Party. Quote, "It wouldn't be too much to say that the Profumo scandal was the necessary prelude to the new Toryism, based on mediocrity which would eventually emerge under Margaret Thatcher." End quote. The Economist suggested that the scandal had affected a fundamental and permanent change in relations between politicians and press. Davenport Hines posits a long-term consequence of the affair, the gradual ending of traditional notions of difference. Authority, however disinterested, well-qualified and experienced, was later, after June 1963, increasingly greeted with suspicions rather than trust. End quote. After expressing his deep remorse to the Prime Minister, to his constituents and to the Conservative Party, Profumo disappeared from public view. In April 1964, he began working as a volunteer at the Tynesby Hall Settlement, a charitable organisation based in Spitalfields which supports the most deprived residents in the East End of London. Profumo continued his association with the settlement for the remainder of his life, at first in a menial capacity, then as administrator, fundraiser, council member, chairman, and finally, president. Profumo's charitable work was recognised when he was appointed a Companion of the Order of the British Empire CBE in 1975. He was later described by Thatcher as a national hero and was a guest at her 80th birthday celebrations in 2005. His marriage to Valerie Hobson lasted until her death on the 13th of November 1988, aged 81, and Profumo himself died aged 91 on the 9th of March 2006. In December 1963, Keller pleaded guilty to committing perjury at Gordon's June trial, and she was sentenced to 9 months imprisonment, of which she served only 6 months. After 2 brief marriages in 1965 and 66 to James Livermore and in 1971-72 to Anthony Platt that produced a child each, the eldest of whom was largely raised by Keller's mother, Keller largely lived alone from the mid-1990s until her death. Most of the considerable amount of money she had made from newspaper stories was dissipated by legal fees during the 1970s. She said, "I was not living, I was surviving." Keller published several inconsistent accounts of her life in which Ward had been variously represented as a gentleman, her truest love, a Soviet spy, and a traitor, ranking alongside the Cambridge Five, which is another case I'll cover in another episode of this podcast. Keller also claimed that Profumo impregnated her and that she subsequently underwent a painful abortion. Keller died on the 4th of December 2017, aged 75. Rice-Davies enjoyed a more successful post-scandal career as a nightclub owner, businesswoman, minor actress, and novelist. She was married 3 times in what she described as her slow descent into respectability. Of adverse press publicity, she observed, "Like royalty, I simply do not complain." Rice-Davies died on the 18th of December 2014, aged 70. Ward's role on behalf of MI5 was confirmed in 1982 when the Sunday Times located his former contact Woods. Although Denning always asserted that Ward's trial and conviction were fair and proper, most commentators believed that it was deeply flawed, and historical injustice according to Davenport Hines, who argues that the trial was an act of political revenge. One High Court judge said privately that he would have stopped the trial before it reached the jury. The human rights lawyer Jeffrey Robertson has campaigned for the case to be reopened on several grounds, including the premature scheduling of the trial, lack of evidence to support the main charges, and various misdirections by the trial judge in his summoning up. The Criminal Cases Review Commission, which has the power to investigate suspected miscarriages of justice, reviewed Ward's case starting in early 2014, but in 2017 decided not to refer it to the Court of Appeal after failing to find the original transcript of the judge's summoning up. After his recall in January 1963, Ivanov disappeared for several decades. In 1992, his memoirs The Naked Spy were serialized in the Sunday Times. When this account was challenged by Profumo's lawyers, the publishers removed offending material. In August 2015, the independent newspaper published a review of a forthcoming history of Soviet intelligence activities by Jonathan Helsom. This book suggests that the relationship between Ivanov and Profumo was closer than the latter admitted, alleging that Ivanov visited Profumo's home and that such was the slackness of security arrangements that he was able to photograph sensitive documents left lying about in the minister's study. Keller describes a 1993 meeting with Ivanov in Moscow. She also records that he died the following year, aged 68. Astor was deeply upset at finding himself under police investigation and by the social ostracism that followed the Ward trial. After his death in 1966, Cliveden was sold. It became the first property of Stanford University and later a luxury hotel. Rackman, who'd first come to public notice as a sometimes boyfriend of both Keller and Rice-Davies, was revealed as an unscrupulous slum landlord. The word Rachmanism entered in English dictionaries as the standard term for landlords who exploit or intimidate their tenants. To this day, the scandal remains with many questions unanswered, and we may never really know the truth behind all of this. With that, this case remains open, but with many unanswered questions that still remain unanswered. Please rate this show and let me know what you guys think about this and the many other cases I've covered. You can follow me on all major social media platforms, YouTube, BitChute, Dailymotion. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram, links are all down below in the description. If you have a case you'd like me to have a look at or cover, don't hesitate to send me a message. I'm your host, and this has been the Unanswered Questions podcast. Until next time. Next on Unanswered Questions. Now, as I understand it, the Vietnam War POW MIA issue concerns the fate of United States servicemen who were reported as missing in action MIA during the Vietnam War and associated theaters of operation in Southeast Asia.